So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation is from the very original manuscripts of the Holy Hebrews of old, and also the Holy Prophets of the antiquity from the land of Israel, has given us then the understandings and the prophecies related with the time, and prophecies related with the end. The prophet Zechariah then gives us a very interesting point of then the many multi-layers of then the prophecies related with existing time he was living in, plus then the end and the time of the end. As we read then the 12th chapter of Zechariah, he speaks then of an understanding of the future related with the house of David. He then gives us the precise understanding of the second service of the Holy Tabernacle. He speaks very plainly in plain words, stating then what he then did give the people the understandings from heaven related with the second services of the Holy Tabernacles. As he explains then, he speaks in the name of Yahweh, and he said Yahweh would then pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and also petitions. So translating what this means in a spirit, we then understand the laws regarding the Torah in its original state has no mercy. So we understand the first service of the Holy Tabernacle was instituted as a no deviation laws. If a person would then sin, would be requiring death. Death of the animal as a substitute, pointing to the Messiah coming in the future. So then when we read Zechariah, gives us the absolutely certainty of then the future Messiah would bring for the second service. Read how this is so interesting and imperfect. And he himself, Yahweh, would pour upon the house of David. He is speaking of then the loyalty of the King David related with the Torah. But then Zechariah is speaking in the future tense. Try to understand the spiritual understanding of Zechariah, pointing the troublesome times that the nation was living in. What was going on? The nation again was not obedient. So then it began to drift away. And then Zechariah came precisely as his previous brothers, prophets, obviously pointing out the problems. You can read. There is a step of formation every time. First comes then the problem. Then comes the prophet pointing out the problem and then showing them what the problem is. Then the prophet indicates the returning of the people from their pagan ways, from their evil ways, then back to the instructions. Then afterwards comes then the words of the prophet regarding the extras. What then is giving the people these extras if they were obedient? Precisely as we read in the 12th chapter. Then we read, and Yahweh himself will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and petitions. This gives us the true understanding of the cities of the future, the representatives of Jerusalem as a camp from the time of Moses. Gives us precisely, and then he states, the spirit of grace and of petitions, and they shall observe upon me whom they have pierced. Speaking of the Messiah. So Zechariah was prophesying of the time of the camps, the cities. And most importantly, in fact, afterwards then Zechariah points out the day when the Messiah returns. And they, the ungodly, those that then became against the holy cities and the beloved city in the future. So we have actions of the autumn feast shown in Revelation of these cities. Because it states, He would pour out then the house of David upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace. He is not speaking of the actual city of Jerusalem and then speaking of the actual facts of the time. He was speaking of the future. That's why we read then, in the future then the inhabitants of the house of David. He's speaking of a concept. The concept of obedience. David was a loyal person. Though he made mistakes, as many of us do, but he was loyal. Then it was extended this grace. And then he's speaking of then the holy tabernacles. This is what Zechariah is prophesying. So then, he's stating then, obviously, whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourn for his only son, and shalt be then very angry, as one that has anger of his then understanding. He is speaking of then, because of the Messiah, he's returning, and then the people, the evil people, would be angry, because they know for sure they are condemned. Because he's speaking of the vengeance. And then he states then, obviously, the mourning, and then he speaks of the final combat of the end. And then he speaks of the day, when the day comes, and that day, and the day when it comes. And then he speaks in the 12th chapter, the 9th verse, and it shall come. In that day, he's speaking of the second portion of the Torah, the autumn feast, Revelation. This is what Zechariah is speaking of. So we understand the steps of formation from Zechariah, we understand the steps of formation from Yeshayahu, we understand the steps of formation of Yirmiyahu and the other prophets. We understand there are steps of formation, identifying the problem. Then comes the prophet. The prophets identify what's going on. Then the prophet then gives the warnings. Then the prophet then points the people back to the instructions. Never changes. Then when people they repent, they are obedient, they understand their senses were wrong, they were in the path of destruction, they were going after paganism, and they return to the instructions, and then Yahweh gives them extras. Because Zechariah is showing the future based upon Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse to the 44th verse. This is what Zechariah is speaking of. So every time when you read the prophets, you begin to understand lines, layers of understanding, and then you begin to find those very popular amongst the prophets of old. You find at times when then the second services of the Holy Tabernacles were established, for instance, Zechariah is speaking of. However, the point and time of Zechariah's understanding of the cities, first comes the city and then the cities, because he's speaking of the grace and petitions upon the house of Jerusalem. So he's speaking of a model. And then when he relates to the very end, and when that day comes, he's speaking of the returning of the Messiah. Then the city as the city itself, rebuilt at the time, plus the linking of the representatives linked up in the spirit. That's why Zechariah, he speaks of then singular understanding, but we in the spirit, we understand is plural. Because it's a spirit understanding. We know Zechariah spoke of the city of Jerusalem. But we understand before Jerusalem is rebuilt, the cities must be rebuilt first. Because the Messiah, while he was rejected from the holy plan, he said then, go around the world to form holy tabernacles, as per the design of Moses. Then we understand at some point those tabernacles are going to join up and they're going to start praying for Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem gets rebuilt. Because those were the steps of formation from the last orders from the Messiah himself. Then when Zechariah prophesies at the end, in that day, we understand he's speaking of the city as a representative, but prior of this representation comes first the cities rebuilt. So the whole step of formation then comes in place. That's why we read then the Spirit of grace. He is speaking of Yahweh himself. He gave his Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, very active in each of the holy camps. Those were the cities. And then the CT as a representative. So we find extremely clear as then Zechariah gives the extras to his people. And after he gave these extras, obviously the people then they became to be obedient. Because this is the whole purpose. So you begin then with the prophet identifying the problem, the prophet coming and pointing the people back to the instructions and giving warnings, and then we find the people repenting, and then extras giving afterwards. It is always this section in terms of step-by-step procedure. Because Yahweh would never give them extras if they were not obedient. He found some of the people being obedient, and because on behalf of those who were obedient, then Yahweh gave those extras. Because there were enough people during his time that could turn the others around and pointing them to the proper direction. That's why we find Zechariah then is speaking of grace, petitions, he's speaking of prayers in the Holy of Holies. This is what it means when we read Zechariah the 12th chapter. He's speaking of the Torah. He's speaking of the autumn feast. Grace, Spirit of grace was given after the spring feast was completed when the Messiah was nailed to the pole. Then grace was instituted, grace in the Torah for the purposes of the second service, where they would remain as per the first service, but understanding when there is a sin, there is repentance in exchange for the death of animals. But the entire understanding from the first service remains as it was. And then we find other similitudes from other prophets in other times, pointing the people for the completion of them both. You find sometimes prophets coming, identifying the problems, and then pointing the people, giving them warnings, and then afterwards pointing the people back to the instructions. And some of the people then became very obedient. Yahweh used those few to turn the others around as they were obedient. Then the extras were given them in order for the others to listen to Yahweh, and through his people then they began to be obedient. And then as they received those extras, those very few entrusted with Yahweh's word, they were able then to turn the country around. And that's why we have so clear understanding from the holy prophets of what we should expect from the future. And then kind of interesting, because then afterwards he speaks then the end of the times, the great combat of the end, and then he speaks, and the land shout, mourn, every family apart, the family house of David, and so on and so forth. Then the family of the house, the Levi, gives us another layer of what's going on. So when Yahweh speaks, he speaks in layers. And we must identify those layers and then link them up, so then we understand the plan of heaven. So then we understand precisely what then Zechariah is giving to his people. There are layers related with the time that Zechariah was living in. There were revelations given for the time of the end. So you have to understand in how to identify what Zechariah is speaking regarding the nation at the time, what they should be doing, and then the consequences of their sins at that moment. And then they would understand the extras of the future if they would remain obedient. Those are the layers that we must identify. As we understand, Zechariah, he was prophesying prior of the destruction of the temple. So parts of the prophecy is related during the time. Prophecies are then in distinct times related with distinct prophecies, and we have to identify what those means. But certainly we understand prior of this last part of the chapter of Zechariah, the 12th chapter, we understand until the very end. That's the end when the world ends. The last great combat. And then you have another understanding comes in, and then you have to understand what those mean, so it can link up with the other section of the prophecy. So then we understand in that day what it means. And then the spirit of grace and petitions is speaking of the Kadosh Kadoshims, and then the priests performing the services as they used to do in the past. Other than sacrificing animals, they would be involved in worship and petitions. That's the proper way of identifying and then interpreting holy prophecies. They are in layers. You can't read on flat surfaces. But then the problem is, most people, they think the Torah was abolished. When they read the prophecies, they don't understand. Because they are not founded upon the foundation of the instructions. They have a preconceived idea that the foundation that they have, then it's not there. How are they going to understand in layers? They don't understand. The spirit in them confuses them. That's why we emphasize it's important reading the instructions, because with the foundation in place, then you understand the apostles afterwards. Because what does it mean, foundation of the apostles and prophets? He's speaking of the second service and the first service. What do you think it means? Laying down of the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Shilishim and prophets. He was speaking of the second service established based upon the foundation laid from the instructions first service and then the second service. Then you understand what he meant. And please stay tuned, much more coming up, because other prophets also spoke in the same tone, in the same understanding, but distinct times and distinct events. However, related with the prophetic line from the time of Moses until the closing of the age, as we have read in Zechariah the 12th chapter, speaks of the very end when this age closes. He finished the layer of understanding of the time of the end at the very end of the great combat. Please stay tuned.